The investment built on a single assumption. It looked diversified. It felt resilient. And yet, everything depended on one quiet belief that nobody thought to challenge. To understand why this story matters today, we need to examine how assumptions hide inside investment structures. Not the obvious ones written in reports, but the foundational ones that feel too basic to question. Assumptions about behavior, about incentives, about what will continue simply because it always has. This investment was not reckless. It was carefully designed. Layers of protection were added. Risks were modeled across scenarios. Exposure was spread across assets, regions, and time horizons. On paper, it appeared robust against almost anything. But beneath that complexity sat a single assumption: that one critical condition would always hold, that markets would function in a particular way, that participants would respond predictably, that a specific relationship would remain stable under stress. Because the assumption felt structural, it was treated as fact. It wasn't stress-tested aggressively. It didn't receive contingency planning. It was embedded so deeply that removing it would unravel the entire design. And so it remained untouched. As long as the assumption held, everything worked. Returns were steady. Volatility stayed contained. The investment absorbed shocks exactly as intended. Each successful period reinforced confidence, not just in performance, but in the underlying logic. Over time, attention shifted away from foundations and toward refinement. Fees were optimized, allocations were adjusted, efficiency improved. The assumption faded further into the background, no longer visible as a choice, but accepted as reality. This is how single points of failure survive inside sophisticated systems, not through neglect, but through familiarity. When something has never broken, it stops being monitored. When it stops being monitored, it stops being protected. The danger was not that the assumption was wrong. It was that it was absolute. The entire structure required it to remain true. There was no margin for deviation, no alternative path if it weakened. And when markets changed, they didn't announce it by breaking the assumption outright. They tested it, quietly. At first, the assumption did not fail. It bent. Small deviations appeared, but they were absorbed without consequence. The system adjusted. Performance remained intact. These early tests felt reassuring. If the structure could handle variation, the belief must be sound. What went unnoticed was how much effort those adjustments required. Buffers were quietly consumed. Flexibility was reduced. Contingencies designed for rare use became routine. The assumption was still holding, but only because the system was compensating for it. As conditions continued to shift, the compensation grew more complex. Interventions stacked. Timing mattered more. Dependencies increased. The investment began relying on coordination rather than resilience. What once worked passively now required active support. This is where the danger deepened. The assumption was no longer just holding. It was being protected. And protection creates fragility. When something must be defended to remain true, its failure becomes more consequential. Participants noticed the strain, but interpreted it narrowly. Adjustments were framed as refinements, not warnings. After all, performance remained acceptable. Losses were limited. The structure still appeared intact. Because the assumption sat at the foundation, challenging it felt disproportionate. Questioning it would have meant questioning the entire investment. And when so much capital and reputation depend on a design, the cost of doubt feels higher than the cost of accommodation. Over time, the system grew less tolerant of surprise. Small shocks now required immediate response. Delays mattered. Timing mismatches became visible. The investment was no longer absorbing change. It was negotiating with it. This is how single assumptions become traps. They do not collapse suddenly. They narrow options gradually. Each workaround reduces flexibility. Each success reinforces a belief that the assumption remains safe. But safety built on constant adjustment is not safety. It is effort disguised as stability. And effort has limits. The conflict emerged when the assumption faced a condition it could not bend around. Not an extreme event, but a persistent one, the kind that refuses to resolve quickly. The system had been built to manage shocks, not endurance. As pressure continued, Compensating mechanisms reached their limits. Buffers were depleted. Timing windows narrowed. What had once been flexible responses became rigid requirements. The investment needed everything to work in sequence, without interruption. This is where the single assumption revealed its power. Because it sat beneath every layer, its weakness propagated everywhere at once. Diversification failed not because assets moved together, but because the foundation supporting them all was slipping. Participants attempted to adapt. Exposure was adjusted. Structures were modified. But every change interacted with the same constraint. The assumption could no longer support the weight placed on it. And without an alternative framework, adaptation became reactive. Losses began to accelerate, not violently but persistently. Each period of underperformance forced new decisions. Each decision reduced future flexibility. The system entered a narrowing loop, where every response made the next response harder. What made this moment so destabilizing was clarity. The realization that the investment was not failing because of complexity, but because of simplicity. One belief, treated as immutable, had shaped everything. By the time this was fully understood, reversal was no longer clean. Exiting meant accepting losses. Holding meant enduring further erosion. The assumption had turned from silent support into active risk. The buildup was complete. What had once held the structure together was now pulling it apart, and there was no way to remove it without dismantling everything above it. The resolution did not come from fixing the assumption. It came from abandoning it. The realization was slow and uncomfortable, because letting go meant admitting that the entire structure had been built too narrowly. Once the assumption was finally questioned, everything else made sense. The warning signs, the growing effort, the shrinking flexibility. What looked like a series of unrelated issues was actually one problem expressed many times. Unwinding the investment was not elegant. Positions had to be reduced gradually. Losses were accepted incrementally. There was no single moment of relief, only the slow return of optionality. Flexibility was rebuilt the hard way, by shrinking commitments. In hindsight, the lesson was not about the specific assumption itself. It was about concentration of belief. Systems can tolerate many small uncertainties. They cannot tolerate one absolute certainty that must always hold. This pattern repeats because foundational assumptions feel invisible when they work. They are rarely discussed, rarely stress-tested, and rarely given alternatives. Yet they carry more risk than any visible exposure. What happened here was not a failure of intelligence or effort. It was a failure of imagination. The inability to picture a world where the most basic belief might weaken, not collapse, just drift. Markets do not punish complexity. They punish rigidity. The most dangerous assumptions are the ones that feel too obvious to question. Every investment rests on beliefs. The resilient ones are built on many that can bend. The fragile ones depend on one that cannot. The